Good afternoon and welcome. I'm honored and deeply grateful to be here with you for this celebration of our shared work. First, let me thank our Board of Trustees, who are profoundly committed to Bank Street's mission, and in particular, my partner and our chair, Yolanda Farrell-Brown. Thank you also to my team and to each member of the Bank Street community, faculty, staff, students, families, and alumni. Thank you for your deep engagement, thoughtful advice, and your efforts to welcome me into the life of this great institution. To our many special guests who have joined us today, we're honored to have you here. I also want to thank my wife, Cynthia, whom I love more each day we spend together. And my parents, Val and Len, who taught me to value the power of curiosity and imagination. I was born in South Africa. I stayed there for just the first year of my life. My parents refused to raise a child in an apartheid state. They moved our family to Michigan, and that's where I grew up. Then, during my senior year of high school, my dad moved back to Durban. I went to a progressive high school that believed in learning beyond the classroom walls, which allowed me to spend 6 months doing a series of independent studies back in South Africa. It was 1989. South Africa was in the last days of apartheid. Police were still shooting teenagers engaged in peaceful protests. Each month, thousands of young people were detained without trial. Government-supported death squads targeted community leaders. I was based in a school called Phambili, which had been set up by the anti-apartheid movement for Black students who had been expelled from the government schools. The students were there because they were leaders in their classrooms and their communities, but the government's actions were short-sighted. In singling out these brave leaders, the government brought together a remarkable group of young people who were intent on changing the world. The students at Phambili had extraordinary abilities, and I got to know them well. They taught me my first lessons in leadership and courage. The friends I made at Phambili were willing to lose their lives, to endure torture at the hands of the police, to live in hiding, sometimes never sleeping in the same place twice. My friend Musa, who led the student council, was attacked and stabbed 12 times one evening by a death squad on his way home after leading a community meeting. He survived barely, but he was back at school 2 months later, continuing the fight for democracy and an end to apartheid. I returned home changed by this experience. I was dismayed at the power that institutions can wield, yet also deeply inspired by these young people's resilience. I went off to college to study the American educational system. I graduated and came to New York to become a teacher. And I began to understand something stunning. 8,000 miles from South Africa, I found another deeply segregated school system that was unable to provide a good education for all its students. When I started my career in New York City public schools in 1994, the graduation rate was 44.3%. 44.3%. That wasn't an aberration. Every year, the city graduated less than half of its children. It was clockwork, almost as if the system had been designed to fail half our children every year. Over the next 20 years, I worked at just about every level of the school system. I went from a 6th grade math teacher to a high school principal to the deputy chancellor at the Department of Education. Over this period, I felt the inequity of our system and the effects it yielded. I worked closely with young people for whom our schools were perpetuating injustice instead of providing opportunity. But I also saw something more hopeful. I saw the work of Debbie Meyer at Central Park East. I saw the work of Eric Nadelstern at International High School. And I began to come across educators who had been trained at a place called Bank Street. In these schools, and at Bank Street itself, where I enrolled in the leadership program, I found a different kind of practice, where the focus was not on controlling young people, but on creating learning communities where they could grow and flourish. Schools where teachers' voices were at the heart of decision-making, and each day educators began with the question, how can we build from our students' strengths rather than their deficits? When I left the Department of Ed in 2014, the system had begun to change. More than 800 vibrant new schools had been created, many rooted in student-centered practice, including the school I started, Bronx International. Decades of neglect had begun to be replaced with a shared sense of urgency to address inequality. Today, the graduation rate stands close to 70%. This higher percentage really represents people, thousands more young people who are now graduating high school each year. But even with this progress, deep challenges remain. 9% of students from low-income backgrounds in this country end up with a bachelor's degree. This means, of course, that 91% of students from low-income backgrounds do not. If you finish high school today, but don't make it through college, chances are you'll find yourself earning poverty-level wages, which just aren't enough to cover the basics of housing, food, and childcare. You and your family will constantly be living on the edge. We must do better. We owe our children more. So today, as we pause to celebrate the first 100 years of Bank Street and look ahead to the next century, I ask you to commit with me to changing the future. Where do we start? I want to share 5 guiding principles from my time in education so far, 5 ideas that I believe are central to reform at a classroom, school, and systems level. Number 1, children need to be known well. When you have large schools, high student-teacher ratios, and a structure that encourages standardization, you end up with children and adults interacting without developing real relationships. If children don't feel known, they don't feel connected, then they will not engage, they will not communicate, and most of all, they will not learn. This is even more important for children whose lives have been destabilized by poverty. Barbara Biber led the research division here at Bank Street for many years. Writing 50 years ago about supports for children living in poverty, Barbara argued that it's critical for our educators to be aware that all children bring strengths into our classrooms. Our task, she reminded us, is to listen to them very hard, to try to understand them. Children need to be known well. This must be our starting point. Number 2, in schools, the way adults learn always shapes the way students learn. Educators must be engaged in authentic learning communities. When teachers aren't given the chance to think and learn together, when they don't explore students' work together or share their own work with each other, they stop growing. When teachers stop growing, learning for children becomes an exercise in compliance. But when educators are actively connected to their colleagues, they solve problems, they generate new ideas, and they bring that lively and engaged thinking into their classrooms. Educators must be engaged in authentic learning communities. Number 3, evidence matters. We learn about others and make most decisions based on carefully gathered evidence of many types. In educational settings, this evidence should draw thoughtfully on both careful observation and hard numbers. We cannot shy away from the question of whether our children are learning and how they are developing because of this learning. Schools succeed when they develop cultures where faculty regularly use evidence to explore questions like, what are our students' strengths? What do we mean by good student work? How good is good enough? And what can we do differently? Children and educators alike need honest and practical feedback on what's working to help them learn and grow. Evidence matters. Number 4, change is sustained by purposeful and detailed planning. As Bank Street's founder Lucy Sprague Mitchell said when she left her position at Berkeley to create Bank Street, I was tired of working in an ivory tower with golden domes but no firm foundations. I wanted to mix cement and sharp stones and build an educational foundation which would develop people with live thinking and live feelings. Lucy built that foundation. Live thinking is at the heart of Bank Street's work today. We heard this in the vivid stories my colleagues shared earlier. But let's consider her other point, mixing cement and sharp stones. Mixing cement and sharp stones. The tough, hard daily choices about how children and adults spend their time, how money is spent, how we communicate, and how decisions are made. Answering these questions purposefully and clearly is the foundation of healthy institutions, and it's the difference between conflict and sustainable change, whether it's a classroom, a school district, or a college like Bank Street. Change is sustained by purposeful and detailed planning. And finally, number 5, innovation requires autonomy. Policy decisions need to be made as close as possible to the people who have to implement them. This isn't easy, and it typically involves what's referred to as failing fast. Making mistakes is a key stage in developing new ways of working and thinking. Educators need the freedom to experiment. Compliance-oriented systems have failed us over and over again. The slow-motion disintegration of New York State's teacher evaluation system is just the latest example of this failure. If we want to see different outcomes for children, educators must have the freedom and support to shape the classrooms and schools that they are leading. The key value that animates each of these principles and much of Bank Street's work over the past century is the importance of finding and building on the strengths in our students, our colleagues, and the schools we work with. To do this well, we must believe these strengths can be found, whether you're looking for them in South Africa or the South Bronx. So let me tell you a story that illustrates the power of this value. It's about a teacher and a student. I'll refer to them as Emily and Giovanni. Emily was a 6th grade special education teacher up in the South Bronx at a middle school just 15 minutes away from where I started Bronx International. In her first year of teaching, Emily had Giovanni as a student. Giovanni was an English language learner who was doing the 6th grade for the second time. The year did not go well for Emily or Giovanni. And in Emily's second year of teaching, they found themselves together again. Giovanni was doing the 6th grade for the 3rd time, and Emily was thinking about applying to law school. The difference this time was that Emily was taking a class with Cecilia Trau, who started last month as the dean of our graduate school. Cecilia taught Emily about descriptive review, an inquiry process based on this idea. Even in the most difficult circumstances, strength can be found, and when it's discovered, it can be the basis for reimagining possibilities. As Emily puts it, the process involves a series of careful observations of students in different situations without making any judgments. You also examine student work and discuss with your colleagues what you see. Cecilia suggested to Emily to focus on one child. Emily chose Giovanni. By that point, Emily's relationship with Giovanni had dissolved. He threw pens, pencils, and everything else around the room. He tipped his desk over and made fun of other students. Perhaps most frustrating for Emily, Giovanni refused to acknowledge her. When she would talk to him, Giovanni would say to his classmates, "Do you hear anything? I don't hear anything." Giovanni would just make it impossible to lead a lesson. Emily began to think he was a really bad kid, that he was malicious. And then Emily began to closely observe Giovanni and describe his actions. When she did, she noticed patterns in his behavior that she'd missed before. For example, when Giovanni had to produce his own writing, he'd act out. He was insecure that he couldn't write well. It took time to notice that. In the meanwhile, some teachers would get frustrated. "That's why you got a 1 on the state test," a colleague of Emily's said to Giovanni. "That's why you're repeating the grade for the 3rd time." Emily was starting to understand Giovanni a little better. And this was happening just as the middle school was holding a dance. 2 kids at the school were banned from the dance. One student because he'd brought a knife to school, and Giovanni because his teachers did not trust him. Emily is chaperoning the dance, and as she looks outside, at one point she sees Giovanni and his sister and a cop. "Oh no," she says to herself, "what did these kids do now?" She approaches Giovanni, who's holding a box. Inside the box is an emaciated puppy. "Miss," Giovanni says, "we found this puppy, and it needs to go to a doctor, and this cop won't help us." Emily had a choice to make. It was getting late on a Friday night at the end of a long week. Emily could have decided not to engage, but instead she took a risk and got on the phone looking for a 24-hour animal hospital. She found one in Manhattan that was open. She called Giovanni's mom and then got in a cab with him and his sister and the puppy. In the cab, Giovanni starts talking a mile a minute. "I love animals," he says. "I watch Animal Planet all the time." Meanwhile, his sister pipes in and starts talking about how Giovanni is always building these little machines at home, how he's built his own remote-controlled car. Turns out Giovanni is brilliant at building things. Giovanni also shares that they live in a homeless shelter. "But we're moving soon," he says. "And after we move, I'm not going to be bad anymore. I'm tired of being bad." The trio arrive and get the puppy the help he needs at the vet. Afterward, Giovanni and his sister are walking down the street, looking into the stores on the Upper East Side. They're going a little crazy, they're so excited. It turns out they'd never been to Manhattan before. This experience was transformative for Emily. After the puppy rescue mission, Emily's relationship with Giovanni improved dramatically, and Emily realized how important it is to listen to children, especially the ones with the most challenging behaviors. I'm happy to tell you Emily continued as a teacher instead of going to law school. And that year, Giovanni graduated from 6th grade, and today he's a high school student. I hear this story, and I want to know, did any of Giovanni's teachers ever ask him what he cared about, what he liked to do? What support was Emily's principal getting to build a strong learning community for the teachers in his school? If more of Giovanni's teachers had the support Emily did to look closely at his experience in school, would he have been in the 6th grade 3 times? And even earlier, what kind of early childhood education did Giovanni receive? What supports did his family have? And what was the crisis that led them to live in a homeless shelter? These are the complex questions we have a responsibility to tackle. Giovanni's story is a reminder that the assumption of human capacity and strength is powerful ground for real education. Acting on this assumption requires a rethinking of systems and classrooms and schools. And that is the mantle we, not just me, assume today as we look ahead to our next century. Mixing cement and sharp stones for a better world, a more just world, that is our work. At Bank Street, we're already hard at work on this task. Last summer, we began a partnership with the city to provide professional development and coaching to thousands of pre-K teachers and school leaders. We mobilized our faculty and alumni to share their expertise in classrooms across the city. The heart of this training is helping educators to create environments where young children are known deeply, where young children are encouraged to develop the creativity and resilience they will need to succeed in life. We're also clear that as a nation, we have a long way to go to truly meet the needs of our youngest citizens. That's why this year, with the generous support of our alumna and trustee Lynn Strauss, we launched the Strauss Center for Young Children and Families. Thank you, Lynn. In recent decades, a convergence of research about brain development has confirmed what parents and teachers have long known. Young children are primed for learning. The early years are a time of immense opportunity. 90% of our brain architecture is developed before we turn 5. For the 16 million children, like Giovanni, growing up in poverty in this country, the toxic impact of the experiences they face can have devastating educational consequences. Today, the infrastructure to support development and learning in the early years remains weak, particularly in our high-poverty communities. The Strauss Center will allow Bank Street to engage in practical research that can be used to develop solutions for practitioners and for leaders at the city and state level. We're also engaged in rethinking how teachers are trained across the country. When you walk into a classroom of a teacher trained at Bank Street, the room hums. It's alive with purposeful activity and play. After decades of experience, we know that aspiring teachers need time to practice in schools that nourish their learning. They need to be supported by mentors who themselves are great practicing teachers. We know that theory is important, but it only matters if it's used. Young teachers need time to reflect on how to connect theory and practice. Sadly, today in the United States, teacher training is a fragmented marketplace where knowledge, quality, and practice lose out over and over again to the imperatives of fast and cheap. Across the country, districts find themselves short sufficient teachers, and despite their best intentions, end up focusing on getting warm bodies to fill vacancies as quickly and as cheaply as possible. At Bank Street, we're working on a plan to change this paradigm and build a coalition of teacher training programs, school districts, and states who are committed to devoting more public funding to high-quality teacher training. All of these efforts start from the same premise. We have to build from our strengths by first ensuring that children are known well, Second, engaging educators in authentic learning communities. Third, gathering evidence to support growth. Fourth, ensuring purposeful and detailed planning. And fifth, entrusting the key decisions to the educators who have to implement them. To close, I want to acknowledge one of my early mentors, Maxine Greene. She was an educator and a philosopher. She passed away last year. Maxine fiercely pushed us to use our imagination to envision a different kind of world, to challenge existing arrangements that don't work and are unjust. I first heard Maxine speak when I was a first-year teacher. One of her phrases that day still moves me. She said, "I want to awaken people not only to see, not only to feel, but to hold somebody's hand and to act. That's why I talk of social imagination." She would often quote a Wallace Stevens poem, The Man with the Blue Guitar. It begins, "They said you have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are." The man replied, "Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar." And they said then, "But play you must, a tune beyond us, yet ourselves." The blue guitar is our social imagination, our capacity, as Maxine put it, to look beyond what is and conceive of a better world that is not yet. I thought of this poem when I found a eulogy for Lucy Sprague Mitchell. It was written by Charlotte Windsor, who founded Bank Street's teacher training program. She shared a story about Lucy from the 1940s, when Bank Street started working actively in public schools for the first time. Lucy always did first anything she would ask another to do. She was working away, leading geography discussions in schools, almost by the force of her brilliance, bringing the children's thinking to new levels of understanding. One youngster in a Harlem school, after such a session, said to his teacher, "That lady's a genius." When asked why, he quietly answered, "Because she makes us know more than we thought we could." That's what it means to be a great teacher, to illuminate a world beyond us, yet ourselves. So join me in imagining a different future, as Bank Street's founders did 100 years ago, as my friends in South Africa bravely did 25 years ago. We have a responsibility to make sure that teachers like Emily, students like Giovanni, don't give up and aren't given up on. This will take courage, imagination, and a willingness to take risks. We need to act. We need to mix cement and sharp stones to know more, do more, and change more than we thought we could. So I look to you to join us. We've been leading deeply important educational change for 100 years, and we're just getting started. Thank you.